hosting me and your hospitality. I hope my talk this evening is equal to the hospitality that has been shown to me. So, everybody see this? Has anybody seen this painting before? The more I study Civil War, the more this painting speaks to me, and it really, to me, speaks to what are soldiers feeling after the war. You know, so much in Civil War, we enjoy the great battles and the heroic deeds that the soldiers fought for and the great things they did. But as we begin to look at soldiers' experience, we cannot stop at 1865 to look at that experience. We must follow the rest of their lives to see how that experience shaped these men and shaped the rest of their lives. And what we do when we take a critical look, we find that war never really leaves these men. You know, it's a great quote that only the dead know the end of war. Any soldier who has fought on the battlefield and had that experience takes that with them forever. As we look at the end of the Civil War in North Carolina and being associated with Bennett Place, I went out there and started to work and I was like, wow, there's gonna be so many visitors to Bennett Place. And 9 out of 10 people walked in the door and said, we're just here for the bathrooms. You know, like, well, you know what happened here? This is the biggest surrender of the Civil War. I was like, really? I've never heard of that. And so many history books I read got facts about Bennett Place wrong. Just basic, who owned the house where the generals met. So many books, even today, get that fact wrong. And so it really got under my skin of how we as a nation who studied the Civil War to death have overlooked Bennett Place. And I was like, what is wrong with this final campaign of the Civil War that makes us overlook this big event? And, you know, the Bennett Place agreement comes at a time after Appomattox, in the shadow of Appomattox. It's complicated. There's a lot of fits and starts about the surrender. But as I continued to look at the campaign that led up to Bennett Place, I was like, is there something more going on about why we as American historians have put Bennett Place in the shadow of our understanding of the Civil War? And so once you really look at this last campaign, in fact, Sherman's campaign all the way from Savannah through the Carolinas to Goldsboro and on into the Triangle, it's a very dark chapter of the American Civil War that we really have not plumbed the depths of so far. I mean, there's a lot of really dark stuff. So this is the product of 20 years of research and introspection of me trying to figure out, to unravel this last chapter of the Civil War. And so this is my book that's coming out in April. We're gonna have the big book signing at Bennett Place. I thought it was apropos. And I wrote this book 20 years ago about just a chronological narrative of you know, classic military history. And then Mark Bradley came out with this wonderful trilogy of books about the Civil War in North Carolina. I was like, well, I'm just throw it away. I can't top that. So I kind of I was working on a screenplay at the time about, you know, how do we veterans, a war movie. I wanted to sort of recreate a war movie, and I wanted to avoid the cliches of all the war movies, because every war movie, if you stick a veteran in it, they're crazy as a loon, right? So I was like, that's kind of a cliche. So how do I write around that? So I tried to understand the veterans' experience and try to understand what the trauma of being in war in. And the more I studied the trauma of Iraq and Afghanistan soldiers, and to look at Vietnam and World War II, and to see sort of these currents that run through these veterans, and then look at what I was reading in these Civil War letters, and I was like, my God, it's the same thing. We as humans react to war the same way, and it all kind of gets down to stress. Stress on the human body is the same today as it was in 1865, and I would even argue in 1450, if not 1450 BC. That war does this to the human body, and it's just the way we are built biologically. And so I'm going to wander out on some thin ice. I put on my science hat tonight to try to understand how the brain works in stress and how this stress manifests itself in this last campaign. We see it in how the soldiers acted, how they expressed themselves, what they did, and more importantly, how did it shape the rest of their lives? So I want to kind of start out the book with a very simple story about the surrender of Raleigh, the fall of Raleigh. And it happens April 13th of 1865 as Sherman is rolling up from Goldsboro. He steps off of Goldsboro on April 10th, the day after Appomattox. Over 89,000 Union soldiers start chasing the Confederate army of Joseph Johnston as it moves west. And as they start moving west, they learn that Lee has surrendered. Sherman knows that the only thing left to do to end this horrible war is to catch Johnston to destroy the largest remaining Confederate army in the field. Johnston has no one to hook up with. The great plan to rendezvous with Lee in Greensboro and fight either Grant or Sherman falls apart. So it is a great time of chaos. And people in Raleigh, as I will kind of try to make the case, are terrified about what's going on. So as Sherman gets closer to Raleigh, people in North Carolina beg for peace. They know the war is over. So two former governors, Governor David L. Swain and William A. Graham, get a secret mission from Zebulon Vance to go make peace with Sherman, to save the capital and save the university in Chapel Hill. So that's what they do. Sherman agrees to spare the city and the university. And the next day, on April 13th, the two governors race back into town to hand over the keys to power and make it as simple as possible. Now, what happens next kind of, to me, it demonstrates just how much psychological pressure soldiers are under and how what they did in war, what they had to change afterwards for reunification. And how did this trauma shape the memory? Now, on the left is Cornelia Phillips Spencer. I call her the battle axe of the university. She is Ms. Nosybones in Chapel Hill. Her father had been a professor there of mathematics who, strangely enough, had escorted Napoleon in his exile to Elba as a British soldier. Who knew? So he's in Chapel Hill teaching mathematics, and this is his daughter. She marries an Alabamian. He dies early before the war, so she is in Chapel Hill and sees the entire war unfold around her. Now, her neighbor was David L. Swain, the governor who had went out to beg for peace from Sherman. So she gets a lot of stories and she writes down what she sees. And so the earliest history of the end of the Civil War in North Carolina comes from her hand. It's called The Last 90 Days of the War. And you can find it online, it's digitized. And she talks about the fall of Raleigh, and this is what she says. So Swain is on the Capitol, her neighbor. He's waiting for General Judson Kilpatrick and the Union cavalry to ride up Fayetteville Street and take occupation of one of the last remaining Confederate capitals. So as Swain is standing on the stairs, he looks across the street from the Capitol and he sees a problem. Confederate stragglers are rolling in. The rest of the army has already moved out, but these Confederate cavalrymen, which Swain calls the debris of the army, tie up their horses, kick in the door to a jewelry store and start looting it in sight of the Capitol. He says, uh-oh, this is not good. This is going to violate the truce to save the city. So he marches over, confronts these cavalrymen. A screaming match develops. The troopers say, damn Sherman and damn the town too. They care for neither. So as they're screaming at the head of Fayetteville Street, suddenly they hear the strains of Hail Columbia. And they look down Fayetteville Street, and over the hill, they can see the Union column moving up Fayetteville Street. Now, most of these Confederate troopers jump on horses and race out of town to join what's left of the Confederate cavalry guarding the rear of Johnston's moving army, except for one young man. He gets on his horse and he sits there and waits. And as the parade gets closer, he whips out his revolver, starts firing at yelling, hurrah for the Southern Confederacy, puts his pistol back in his holster, whips his horse out, and jets out of town. The only problem is the street that he took did not go out of town. So he hits a dead end, whips his horse around, it slips on the cobblestones, he falls off, tries to remount before he's captured. He's drugged back to the Capitol grounds, and there waiting is a very angry Judson Kilpatrick. So in Cornelia Phillips Spencer's account, she says that Judson Kilpatrick talks to this young man and says, why did you violate the truce? The young man says, I didn't know of any truce. Kilpatrick says, well, too bad. Take this man out to where none of the ladies can see him and hang him. The young trooper says, can I have 5 minutes to write my wife? The Yankee general says no, and he's taken off and hung basically where the governor's mansion is today. That is her version. Now, there's a eyewitness watched the whole thing. This lady right here. Her name is Millie Henry. And Millie was a slave of the Boylan family, who was actually born in Yazoo City, Mississippi. But whenever the Yankees got too close to Mississippi, they brought all the slaves back up to North Carolina. So she is there that morning, that rainy morning on April 13th, drawing water from a well, and she watched the whole thing. She watched the trooper fire, she watched them escape, she watched them brought back before Judson Kilpatrick. Now, in her version, granted, it is a number of years later when the WPA does all the slave narratives, it's a little different. In her version, and it's the only version I can find that names this young man. Judson Kilpatrick says, "What is your name, sir?" The Confederate trooper says, "My name is Robert Walsh of the 11th Texas Cavalry." Kilpatrick again asks, "Why did you fire on my men and violate the truce?" Now, in her version, the young trooper says, "Because I hate the Yankees and wish they were dead in a pile." Worst thing to say. Turns to his staff officers. Kilpatrick says, "Hang this man when none of the ladies can see him." Now, this is where it gets weird, because in her version, once Kilpatrick condemns this man to hang, he begins laughing maniacally, saying, "Thank you, sir, thank you." And Millie said that he laughed all the way till they put his neck in a gallows and broke it. And this is his headstone right here. Kenneth Walsh, 11th Texas Cavalry, April 13th, 1865, in Oakwood Cemetery. Very different versions of this story. Now, I kind of start the book out because in her version, Cornelia Phillips Spencer says, men in these very last days, dark days of war, did some bad stuff, especially the Confederates. But because of their defeat, we should wash away the stains of their crimes. But obviously, what's in Millie Henry's story, that this guy is psychologically unhinged, and who would laugh on the way to the gallows? Now, if we take a step back and look at the 11th Texas Cavalry and what's going on, we really see some really disturbing trends. Now, these very famous pictures, these guys are from the 8th Texas Cavalry, Terry's Texas Rangers, who was a sister regiment of the 11th Texas. Now, when I talk about the war in the Carolinas being really dark, it gets really dark, because a lot of these Confederates, watching Sherman's policy on bringing the war to civilians, it's a lot for them to handle, to watch what these Union soldiers are doing to these homesteads. Now, across Georgia, we do find a lot of Union soldiers executed, largely at the hands of the Confederate cavalry. But going into South Carolina, it doubles. We see Union soldiers who are executed, dismembered, with their throats cut, with placards hung around their necks saying "Death to Foragers." It gets really ugly. It is a tit-for-tat guerrilla warfare on both sides. Now, this guy is John W. Rabb. And looking back to some of the veterans' accounts, they talked about, yes, some of our fellow troopers would have at least 60 notches in their pistol, one for every man they killed. And if you want to know why the Wild West was wild, these guys coming out of the Civil War and heading west truly was that. Now, John W. Rabb, with his 60 notches in his pistols, ended up killing himself in years after the war. Was that due to his war service? Probably so, I think. But it just shows just how psychologically broken down these cavalrymen had been, because they'd been in the saddle for almost a year straight. As Sherman starts his North Georgia campaign, these are the troopers who are trying to catch it. And as Sherman does his march to the sea, these troopers are the only ones that are riding around the edges, trying to stop or at least slow down Sherman's march. So these guys are particularly nasty by the end of the war because of just the strain, the psychological strain that's broken them down. Now, to kind of give you some perspective of starting with the Civil War on up to today, what did we call psychological problems that we saw in soldiers? And it evolves, right? As our understanding increases about how we understand what war does to the mind, the heart, and the soul, it changes. We're figuring it out. And certainly these are sort of the average age of soldiers in each war. Now, I put this up for a couple of reasons, that what we find out that there are a lot of factors that greatly increase a soldier's receptiveness of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Their age, the younger they are, the more susceptible they are. If you were wounded on the battlefield or a prisoner of war, increased your chances of coming away with some long-term psychological problems. And so certainly younger soldiers really suffered this. Now, as we look back in history, through any war, going back to some of the very earliest recorded histories and stories of mankind, we catch glimpses of these little pieces that say, you know, that's really strange. Why would they say that? Going back to Homer, Herodotus, some of these early Greek stories, even some of the earliest Gilgamesh, where they soldiers would talk about having conversations with the dead on the battlefield they'd slain. Or soldiers of the Greek Peloponnesian War that would just suddenly go blind, these crazy physical problems for seemingly no reason at all. So coming out of the Civil War, during the Civil War, doctors start to see things that they can't explain. So these are two doctors who are pretty much in the forefront of trying to understand what's going on with the soldiers. Now, beginning all the way in 1862, the Union Army does a much better job of the Confederates trying to understand the health of their soldiers. Union Army Surgeon General William A. Hammond begins to take stock, and at the end of after the war, incredible compendium, the Medical and Surgical History of the War Rebellion, published in 1870s, really begins to take stock of all of these instances of insanity or nostalgia, they call it, headaches, paralysis, heat stroke, the soldiers would report having these problems with. Now, just as the term post-traumatic stress disorder did not come about after the Vietnam War, 1980, when we began to tie that term to soldiers. And so the same way after the Civil War, doctors began to try to put a name on it, try to understand what went on. And Jacob DaCosta was one of the earliest doctors that coined the phrase, you might have been seen this related to emotional and mental problems with Civil War soldiers, called soldier's heart. They found this cardiovascular anomaly in soldier's heart, that it would just be racing all the time, and they couldn't figure out really what was going on. He wrote a paper in 1871 called On Irritable Heart, a clinical study of the function of cardiac disorder and its consequences. So they thought, you know, maybe it was bad diet, maybe it was sleeplessness, maybe it was just exertion, or maybe it was moral shock. Moral shock. When soldiers could kill, that brooch of their morals caused some physical problem. So they're kind of reaching to kind of grab some idea to put a term for what's going on in these soldiers. Now, another Union Army doctor, Isaac Stearns, is in this sort of this leading class of doctors who are trying to pull together some diagnosis to help to understand all of these veterans that are coming out of the war. And he was trying to look at what they call the unexplainable, constantly reoccurring symptoms that soldiers had, like sleeplessness, uneasiness, and a lack of concentration. And so he believed, again, the culprit was a regular diet, the excessive physical activity soldiers had to go through, and exposure to climate. So, but what they looked at were British doctors who were doing the same thing for soldiers in the Crimean War from the 1850s. And they really kind of circled in on this British doctor named Denis Dibert Hovell. And Hovell was the one that, if we had to put the most accurate Civil War term, like PTSD today, to soldiers, he came up with this incredibly wonderful term that you need to use at your next dinner party to sound really smart. And for them, PTSD is put in terms, they call it postbellum neurokinesis. Postbellum neurokinesis. That's a 50-cent term for sure. But again, they're reaching for it. They're trying to understand. They sense that something is wrong with the nerves of these men about what they're watching. And so modern science gives us this. Now, this is very progressive thought. When you think about Doctors at this time thought it was social problems that caused these, religious problems, moral problems. So I just didn't quite connect the physical problems, what's going on in the mind of soldiers, in the body of soldiers with that service. Now, if you had to break it down in 50-cent terms, this is basically what we're talking about. So in your brain, you've got two sections. The middle section is everything that controls your breathing, digestion, things you don't think about that your body does. Part of your brain is like, all right, we got to breathe, heart, breathe, just that kind of stuff. Now, the frontal lobe is where we, as humans, evolved. It's where we have emotions, where we judgment, where we really do a lot of our thinking, right? Now, what happens when you are in a car wreck, when you're cornered by a bear, when someone breaks into your house, sexually molested, or you're on the battlefield? Trauma, you are a fear. Now, what your body does to protect itself, it flips a switch. It flips a switch. It's like, all right, I interpret the danger. Something's going to happen. So your middle brain says, all right, I'm getting the danger signal. It turns on this cocktail of these neurochemicals that just flush the body. Your heart speeds up. Your vision gets focused. You read about soldiers going into battle when they wet themselves. This comes from this part of the brain. When those chemicals hit, that's what happens. So whenever your brain does this neurochemical cocktail to deal with stress, right? Your muscles get tight, you prepare to fight. It is this natural instinct. Now, after the threat's gone, all of us, most of us, our bodies, the neurochemicals kind of wash out. They kind of leave the brain, your body settles down, it gets back into its natural flow. But when this happens repeatedly, 7 days, 3 days at Gettysburg, Spotsylvania, all of these continued stress up and down, your body gets stuck in this fight or flight mode. So you can't turn off what your body is constantly preparing to fight. And this is where the real damage for soldiers come from, that they cannot disengage from this primal part of your brain. Now, when we talk about PTSD, we've come a long way. No longer is like somebody trying to fake a diagnosis. Through modern science, we can look at the brain and say, here's the damage. There's no uncertainty now that we can see. So this is a healthy brain here. Classic PTSD. Now, this is traumatic brain injury. You hear a lot about that from Afghanistan. It's basically concussion. But if you think about being under a cannonade, the Union line at Gettysburg, what that was like to be under cannonade, that is where traumatic brain injury comes from, that concussion. And then if you look at here, it's both. So literally, the brain changes its way it's built, how it functions, all because of all these neurochemical cocktails that are just stuck in the brain. It's fascinating. And for me to tell it, it's dangerous for a historian to go out and be a scientist, but I think it is such an important part of the story because these are how humans work. Now, we can't go back and diagnose a lot of these soldiers, but if we can understand how this frame works and look at the written literature and what comes out of those medical records, it's pretty plain about what's going on with these men. Now, just to kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about with PTSD, these are some of the symptoms. And once you really understand the symptoms and you go back and read these letters and diaries and hear stories about what great grandpa acted like, you're like, yeah, this great grandpa is pretty classic. And it's powerful to see this manifest itself in the letters and diaries. So what I want to do is to talk a little about some of these men who classically suffered from this. Now, in the shadow of Lieutenant Walsh's hanging body in Raleigh comes this guy. This is Col Newell Gleason. He was the colonel of the 87th Indiana and had fought with Sherman all the way through Georgia and on through the Carolinas. But he really became a notable figure in the Battle of Chickamauga. It was him and the rest of the 87th Indiana who suffered 49% casualty rates on Snodgrass Hill keeping the Union Army from disaster. Now, his combat earned him a promotion, but it also made him a changed man. It became obvious to his junior officers and his men that after Snodgrass Hill, Gleason's mental state was starting to deteriorate. His men witnessed a great transformation into a very troubled man, that they would say that he grew nervous and excitable, erratic with his moods that swung between melancholy and uncontrollable laughing. He would pull fellow officers aside and say, "I know there's a great plot to remove me from command. I just know it." But when Gleason really snapped was when the Army entered South Carolina. And Gleason had always been known as a very strict disciplinarian. But when he goes into South Carolina, he issued this crazy command to all of his soldiers to, quote, "not leave a living thing alive in South Carolina." Now, I think the mental state of a lot of these Union soldiers who've been fighting through some of the most grisly combat of the American Civil War, once they enter South Carolina, the very heart of treason as they saw it, that PTSD really shaped how they waged war. And by that time, they had little sympathy for the rebels or the entire Confederacy. For him to say that, "not to leaving a living thing alive," echoed the sentiment of so many soldiers who under his command. Now, after the war, Newell Gleason went home, but his mental state continually deteriorated until one day in 1886, he basically threw himself down a flight of stairs and killed himself. Now, I talked earlier about this tit for tat executions, and it got really bad. Union authorities said, "all right, if I keep finding my cavalrymen dead with their throats cut, I'm going to start killing Confederates." And they got to the point where these letters exchanged between the cavalries on both sides, and there were a couple of executions that it got that bad. Now, John A. Cundiff had the really unfortunate job to be on one of these firing squads for the Union Army. And as he was as the 99th left Goldsboro and started marching toward Raleigh, Cundiff was there, and soldiers remember that they were loaded down with new equipment, and the day was very hot. And the exhaustion of carrying all this resupply, which they haven't had since North Georgia, really weighed on them. And certainly Cundiff's participation in the execution of this very lone, sad, old man who was a Confederate, was executed by Union authorities in South Carolina, never left him. In fact, it haunted him for the rest of his life. And when he went home, he felt haunted by what he had done. In the years afterward, neighbors claimed that Cundiff would run around and say that rebel spies were after him. And he would, at night, he would not sleep in his bed because he thought these ghosts would find him. So he would take his musket and his blanket and go hide in the woods for days. And his obituary noted that he received 2 wounds which permanently injured his body and his mind. Now, some of you may be more familiar with the individual on the right than the one on the left. There's a lot of Civil War blogs and stories about Civil War dogs. And this is one of the most famous, Harvey. Harvey, who was owned by Captain Daniel M. Stearns of the 104th Ohio. Oh, we do love our Civil War dogs. So, in fact, Harvey wore this special collar. And if everybody found Harvey and read the collar, it would say, "I am Lieutenant D.M. Stearns' dog. Whose dog are you?" Harvey followed the 104th Ohio through all of the campaigns, actually being wounded twice, made his appearance at all of the reunions of the regiment. But sadly, his owner did not fare as well. Stearns had originally went to war in 1861 with the 8th Pennsylvania. After his enlistment expired, he joined the 104th and rose to Company F's first sergeant. And he made his way through the ranks, but again, the war took its toll on him. Probably the worst attack which Stearns pointed to as his mental problems were during the Atlanta campaign in 1864. After 48 hours straight in the saddle, he came down with sunstroke, which a lot of doctors looked at mental strain and mental stress as just simply being, it's too much sun. So it doesn't really show up. So if any ancestors have sunstroke, take a second look at that, because that often turns out to be some type of mental breakdown. And again, Stearns went from fighting in North Georgia and went back to Tennessee to confront Hood at Franklin. And 104th were right there when General Pat Claiborne's division sheared into the Ohio soldiers at the Carter Cotton Gin. So he had seen a lot of combat. And after the war, when he goes home, Harvey becomes his support dog. He spends more time with Harvey than anybody else because Harvey had been there. Harvey knew what the Army had been through. Stearns became irritable, nervous, lethargic, unbalanced, and obsessed with his Army service, and especially Harvey. Family and friends found him humorless and incapable of concentrating, and failed miserably in a number of jobs that he tried to hold. He would grasp his head and constantly complain about the raging pain as though an iron band constricted it. His wife testified it was like a headache, but not. Adding in his pension record that when Stearns walked, quote, the pavement seemed to be rising in front of him, he would say. Harvey stayed with Stearns for over the years until Stearns' condition worsened and his family had him committed to the Cleveland Asylum in 1888. His mental assessment labeled him both suicidal and homicidal by doctors, who attributed his insanity to heredity and intemperance, not the war. Months before his death, Stearns came home. And he was he eventually died in 1890, but what killed a lot of Civil War soldiers, called Bright's disease. Bright's disease is like a number of kidney problems, which due to service in the field, bad diet, days in the saddle. So again, we see a lot of these diseases pop up that killed a lot of these soldiers. Now, perhaps the most mysterious is this guy right here. George Wetstein didn't want to go to war. He avoided it as long as he could. He was caught up in the draft in 1864, left 3 children, including a brand new daughter, and was sent to war. He arrived on April 9th, 1865 in Goldsboro, a day before Sherman steps out. His first time in war. He's never been in a campaign before. As he marches to Raleigh, they camp on the grounds of the state's asylum, we'll talk about in a minute. And one night that, besides being disgruntled with all things military service, as any man would, he didn't want to go, Wetstein complained of a headache. The next morning when they had roll call, Wetstein was nowhere to be found. So when all of his messmates went to go look for him, they looked in his tent and they found that sometime during the night, he had taken off his suspenders, ran part of the suspenders through the buttonhole, put his head through the loop, and killed himself. No one knows why. So he is still buried in Raleigh today. Now, this is a close-up of Dorothea Dix, the state's asylum, which opened its doors in 1856 as the North Carolina Insane Asylum. Now, good for me that this is the city of Raleigh's new park. So I get to creep through all over Dorothea Dix and really get into understanding the Civil War history of this site. And out there is this grave of perhaps one of my favorite Confederate soldiers' names, Aristarchus Jenkins. Love it. Now, to talk about the relationship between war and the state's asylum, the very first patient that ever came into the hospital was a veteran of the Mexican War. Andrew Holderly had went off to go fight in the Mexican War, and there during his service suffered sunstroke. Came back to North Carolina, became a teacher, but when the doors opened in 1856, he was the very first one to be admitted. Now, Aristarchus was just 22 when he volunteered on May 16th, 1861, and his rap sheet of combat is pretty long. He was in the 15th North Carolina. During his time with his brother in the regiment, his brother drowned as they were crossing the Potomac River. Less than a month later, he fought at the Battle of Antietam. With a few more months, he recovered his wounds suffered there and went on to Bristow Station, October 11th, 1862, and was wounded there again. Once again, he returned to the ranks, was wounded again in May of 1864, shot in the shoulder and sent to Richmond hospitals. It was severe enough that he got a 60-day furlough, but the young soldier came back to the ranks for a third time. But he had seen enough. On February 17th of 1865, he deserted to the Union authorities and swore allegiance to the United States and went to Springfield, Illinois. But when he returned home, he was shunned by his family. The salt in the wound of all the war service he had seen. He kind of disappeared forever until he was found on the rosters by a relative on the Dorothea Dix admission rolls. And this is when his headstone was put in sometime in the late 1990s, I think. But looking through the hospital records, you can truly see the impact of war. Not so much during the war, but in the flood afterwards, the hospital is overwhelmed with people suffering. Another Confederate who's fought at Bentonville was Colonel John G. Coltart. Coltart had a pretty lively career with the 26th Alabama and fought away to the Army of Tennessee and led Dee's Brigade at the Battle of Bentonville. But when he went back to Alabama, he took the war with him. Although becoming a sheriff, and we see a lot of these men who actually became professionals after the war, that it was only a matter of time before the war overwhelmed them. They could not keep the war at bay forever. And Coltart's term, 3 years before he entered an asylum in 1868. Now, in researching how the Confederates, what surrender did to them was pretty prolific. On top of all of their war experience was pretty hard. And this is an incredible story I found in the very first issue of the Confederate Veteran magazine. And this was written by a guy named William F. Allison. And I can only imagine that Allison had saw the scene I'm about to describe, and it must have just cut a hole in his heart to carry this story for over 30 years, to get it off his chest in the very first Confederate magazine. And it's an incredible story is that he is walking away from his surrender. He has his parole in his pocket and he's walking towards Salisbury, and he begins looking down and he sees all of these bloody patches in the road, and he thinks, oh, some horse has been bleeding. And as he's walking along with all the other skeletons that are left of the Army of Tennessee, he looks down the road and he sees a group of soldiers and a guy sitting on a pile of cross ties in a paisley shirt. And he's like, huh. But as he gets closer, he kind of starts hearing the conversation. And as he gets even closer, he sees that it is not a paisley shirt he's wearing. It's a white shirt that's covered in blood. And as he gets up close, he catches the end of this conversation where he says, whoever the gentleman is on the log, he says, take my coat. And he looks down, it's a beautiful officer's coat. Take my coat back and give it to my wife. She is the daughter of General Rains, because I won't need it anymore. And incredibly, Allison writes in this little write-up that as he's talking, he keeps putting his hand in his shirt and it's covered in blood and keeps wiping it. And for some odd reason, Allison believes that this is a self-inflicted wound, that this is what the war had come to for this unnamed officer sitting beside the road. And Allison needed to tell this story in vivid war incidents. Now, in North Carolina, we have, especially in central North Carolina, we have Johnston's army, about 36,000 soldiers moving west, followed by Sherman's 89,000 soldiers. Then from the north, we've got all the parolees of the Army of Northern Virginia slamming hungry men who had seen their own war looking for food. So it's almost, civilians in central North Carolina are in a vice, a horrible vice. Now, refugees had been spreading stories about what it was like to be in the path of Sherman's army. And they took horrible stories about houses being burned in front of them, possessions torn up, having to beg for food, pistols being pointed, just the worst stories. And as they refugeed in the central North Carolina, brought all these stories with them. But what really loomed large in central North Carolina was the burning of Columbia, especially for people in Raleigh. this was a big deal. This was an incredible specter that really haunted a lot of their memories. So whenever the army started getting closer, people, especially in Raleigh, start suffering stress. Now, these people had throughout the war, unable to buy a lot of the necessity of war, dealing with the dead relatives who would never see again, fear of slave uprisings. The stress just really began to boil over in these last days of the war. Margaret Devereux, this is her house in Raleigh named Wills Forest, and her husband was the quartermaster general for the state of North Carolina. So he was away a lot of time, and especially as the Union Army moved into Raleigh. Now, in Wills Forest, Margaret had a lot of her refugee relatives who had fled away from the army. So they had lost a lot of their wealth, had lost their identities, lost their friends to try to flee to save themselves. So they were already psychologically stressed. But as the Union Army starts to pull into view, it really just sends it over the edge. And that day when they arrive, slaves bust in the front door of Wills Forest, and they say the Yankees are here. Margaret jumps up and runs upstairs to alert all of the family upstairs. And as she's running down the hall, she's looking out through the rooms and sees her yard filling up with all of these Union soldiers. She races upstairs, and there she finds Mrs. Burgoyne, one of a cousin of hers. And they go to the window and they look out, and they just see a sea of upturned, dirty faces of these Union soldiers. And there's even some crawling up the outside of the house. Now, these women had heard these stories about what Union soldiers were going to do or what they thought they'd do, and their imaginations went wild. So rather than face what they were about to think was going to happen, Mrs. Burgoyne turns to Margaret and says, well, we can throw ourselves from the window. Suicide rather than face what they thought was coming. Lucy Battle, way off in Chapel Hill. Always a matron of her house was said about her. Stern, in control, and a woman who was king of her castle, despite her husband William being there and her son Kemp, who was head of the North Carolina effort for coal out in southern Chatham County. But with the death of two of her sons, the Iron Maiden began to crack. And as the Union Army began to get closer to Raleigh, William, her husband, writes to her son in Raleigh and writes a very telling letter about his wife and his mother. And he writes that your mother is afraid that she cannot get her medicine anymore, that her nerves are in such bad shape that she may return to the state she was when your brothers were killed. So I think this is laudanum. I think she, like many other Southern women, really became addicted to drugs to try to deal with the stress of losing children on the battlefield that, one day they're there and then they are marched off and never to be seen again. So we see a lot of soldiers and civilians in the post-war period have a chronic opium addiction, the first opiate crisis of the United States. Now we talk about the loss of children, and owning two children, I can sympathize with how this must have been for a parent to send off their children never to be seen again. Now, Alfred Whitfield Wooten was a prominent plantation owner in Lenoir, North Carolina. Very prominent in secession movement, lost his wife in October of 1860 and sent both of his sons off to war, and they were killed. A horrible psychological blow to Wooten. And once his plantation was sacked by Union soldiers, he snapped. He truly snapped. He was admitted to Dorothea Dix in June of 1865, refused to eat, and was dead a month later. Horrible, horrible story. But a story that is repeated so much in the literature, in letters, and in the rolls of the admission logs for Dorothea Dix. Now, to give you an idea of what a great source these emission logs are, this is January of 1865. So we have the patient, the date, the age, the sex, what the complaint was, how long they've had it, and there's a whole other page about where they're from, what their final state was, and it is incredible. Now you guys can't see it, but just to see what causes the psychological problems in the people who are admitted it's incredible to look at the wartime versus the pre-war problems. So what we see starting during the Civil War and years afterward was doctors simply could not figure out what was wrong with people and just said the war. The war caused their mental problems. Now, the reason I show this page is that the other people on the home front, which had a very different experience than soldiers and these civilians, are African Americans. How did slaves navigate this incredibly tumultuous time? And they are not immune to the pressure at the end of the war. So if you look right here, this is the very first African American. Dorothea Dix was the first forcibly integrated state institution when Union soldiers forced hospital authorities on April 18th, 5 days after Raleigh falls, to admit Isaac, and their last name, simply African. And you know what he was put in for? Can't see it, but the war. The war. Now, you would think that slaves would be excited for the war to end, and they were, but it's a very dangerous time for them. They go from being valued property to being a liability. Confederates take great joy in executing these slaves who really are excited about freedom. There's several different instances of them just shooting. But this is it, the first admission. And there are some over the next couple of years that are admitted. And amazingly, this guy is Eli Hill, who was one of the very few United States colored troops that Sherman picks up in Goldsboro and as they move inland. So Eli, who had been a slave in Onslow County, enlisted on August 12th and joined the 37th USCTs. And he comes into Raleigh and occupies Raleigh, is there for the end of the war. But for some odd reason, is it all those years in bondage that took its psychological toll on Eli, or was it his short war service? We don't know, but he is placed in the Dorothea Dix Hospital on January 20th, 1870, for the very strange term that is not applied to many white folks, but the term of self-pollution. So he stays there for the next 7 years. Now, to sum up things, it is pretty easy once you start looking for the stories of veterans. Because in the years after the war, newspapers are full of horrible stories of veterans killing themselves, killing family members, going mad. All of these, the GAR starts commenting on all of their insane veterans. And so, yeah, once you start looking for all of these troubled soldiers, they start to come out of the woodwork. And, you know, this is a horrible headline. Shot to and blew his own head off with gun. They're out there. So is this last campaign of Sherman that goes through South Carolina, is it really a chapter in the Union Army victory, a war against civilians that they want to really remember, and the burning of Columbia that kind of got out of control? Do Confederates want to remember the end of the Civil War, about all of their noble and gallant soldiers executing Union soldiers? How that is not the way a noble warrior fights a war. So is this last campaign just kind of a really ugly chapter, that the surrender of Grant and Lee at Appomattox, that noble, these two great warriors shaking hands and walking away, is that a nice tidy bow that we can kind of agree to end on, that Lincoln is still alive, that the entire surrender to Bennett Place is much more ugly? This campaign that leads up to Bennett Place is just devoid of honor. It is a post-Lincoln surrender. So this is why I think there's a lot more going on about how we remember the Bennett place and this end of the chapter. And to take this one step further, and I kind of cut this out of the book because I was on really thin ice, was the idea of it's a new strain of science called epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is the idea that you can pass your trauma on to your descendants. How that works is that all these neurochemical cocktails, they can get in and start screwing with your genomes into your DNA. So you kind of pass on some of these character traits to your children. They've done some studies with the Danish famine in the 1950s about the problems that children have from their parents. Holocaust survivors have had some of this go on. And so how far does the Civil War really echo through those people who felt it? And that's something to really think about that I just could not put in the book. But these families still felt, even today, when we look at children who have suffered trauma, we see more instances of obesity and other mental issues that come down through their parents. And so it's fascinating to look at modern science to understand what truly that Civil War experience was, to understand the experience of those veterans. Thank you all.